Hello and welcome to the Queen Bee podcast, where the stories of regional women come alive, resonate and inspire. I'm your host, Tanya Rutherford, and together with a passionate team of women, we've painted this landscape for you. In truth, this podcast is about gathering the stories of women who live in regional and remote Australia to bridge those gaps, to create communities, and of course, to tell the richness in their journeys. Now, if anything does come up for you today, please be kind to yourself. You can share it with us, whether that's through our socials, our Queen Bee community, or you can send us a DM. Hello and welcome to this week's Queen Bee podcast. Now, joining me today is Kylee Leota.
Hi, everyone.
And the reason I have Kylee here is executive functioning is key to how we think, learn, and just do things. I first came across Kylee when she was facilitating a session on how we can operate differently and how our executive functioning operates differently for each of us. And since this is a big passion of mine, I thought I would forgive Kylee for not living in a regional area, and just so I could make the most of this chance to have a yarn with her. So welcome, Kylee.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And whilst I don't live in a regional area, my mum grew up in Barraba, which is very regional, back end of Tamworth. And when I worked in the education department, I used to go do all the regional schools in Southeast Queensland. So hopefully by, connection, small connection, I certainly hopefully can connect with your community as well, because I've had lots of experience in that space.
Awesome. That sounds great. Now, talking about experience, we'd love to hear some of your backstory. So what got you into education and then into wellbeing?
Yeah, so growing up, I always wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to be a music teacher. The caveat to that is you need to have some musical talent. Whilst it's a passion, and I'm really happy as a backup dancer, no one really ever gives me the mic. Then I wanted to be a PE teacher, but I'm the generation that every kid wanted to be a PE teacher, and there's just not enough teacher jobs in the world for the amount of people that want to do that. And then my background went into, I really have always just really been passionate about individuality, diversity, inclusion, and people being accepted for who they are, whether they're neurodiverse, whether they've got disability, whether they're gifted, whether they're from a cultural background, whether they've just had different lived experiences. And so I started off in work experience when I was in high school, and then from there it turned into a passion. And I was in education for over 20 years. So I worked in a special school, primary school, high school. I was a deputy of inclusion. I was a deputy of mainstream. I was what was called a principal education officer, student services. So I serviced 72 schools in catering for diverse learning. And some of them being like one teacher schools or teaching principal schools in those rural and remote schools, into the leafy green and the really complex behaviour. So for anyone that may know, even if you're regional, you may know things in Brisbane like Logan and Ipswich are well-known, really complex spaces. So that's kind of where I spent a lot of my time, in complex behaviour, lots of comorbid diagnoses, or even just complex life situations that people were navigating. And so I did that for over 20 years. And in actual fact, I injured myself. That's probably the universe's way of going, hey, you may be not living in alignment with your true north anymore. And I've tried to be subtle, Kylee, and you're not picking up what I'm putting down. So, just before COVID, 2019, actually, I injured myself. And so I had a bit of epiphany, because I always thought, Simon Sinek talks about know your why. And I always just thought I wanted to teach. But really, when I sat and did the work, what I wanted to do was empower. And so that helped me really pivot my thinking, because when I injured myself, I was freaking out about what I was going to do. I, again, work with complex kids. So when I injured myself, I couldn't go back to that role. I am a single mum of 3 kids. So primary and only income source. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do here? We're going to get into executive functioning a little bit later, but my executive functioning was not working very well, because I was in a high state of stress, overwhelm, fatigue, burnout from being in pain all the time, and going, oh my gosh, what was that going to do? So I had to step back and go, what is it that I love to do? And how can I utilize that to craft something that I can do moving forward? So from that journey that wasn't necessarily fun to start with, let me tell you, reflective journeys aren't always fun. That turned into this new life where I'm like, okay, what are the skills that I have? What do I love? And how can I encompass my why into my daily work? And so I started off really in that space around neurodiversity. That has led into neurodiversity in organizations, in corporate, but in leadership and high performance teams. And as my journey has grown, I often joke that I'm the accidental business owner because I grew from a long line of people that had jobs my whole career. My parents,
Yeah.
my dad was a bus driver, my bank teller, safety and security and having a job. And I went into a government job, which was very safe and secure. And when I left the government job as a single mum of three kids at the big, in the middle of COVID, my parents thought I was bat crap crazy. And so I joked that I didn't ever go, oh, I'm going to wake up in the morning and be a business owner. But I pivoted and recalibrated and went into this pathway. And now from business owner, I'm now entrepreneur because I actually have a couple of businesses. I've got a few different things going on and I love it every single day. But the key to that was understanding myself well enough to stop hijacking myself to get the outcome I wanted.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
And I think
Yeah.
it's really interesting, coming back to what you said about you always thought you want to be a teacher. And I think that's it. We when we start thinking about what is our purpose, we often label it to a job description. And
Yeah,
that's why we
100%.
also put our identity on a job description instead of what the impact that we're trying to create.
Yeah, for sure. And who am I if I'm not an educator?
Yeah.
And and that's where I'd been doing the work wrong for a little while. And so when I recalibrated and actually, that was what I did, or, and how I did it was through diversity and inclusion. It wasn't why, it wasn't my why. And when I looked at, I loved empowering people and have this special love for people that kind of the system had written off, that have
Mm.
said, oh, you sit over there or you'll never make anything of yourself. And I have had a really great experience, even in my corporate work, of people calling me going, look, we're going to manage this person out of the company. I'm going to put them on managing underperformance. This is their last chance, Kylie. If you can't do anything with them, they're out. And I've had a really, really successful turnaround on all of those cases that have been sent to me, I guess, because I take the time to understand, because people's behavior, I don't know a single person, I do not know a single person who wakes up in the morning and says, geez, I want to do a bad job today. I don't want to do it. I want to do a bad job as a parent. I want to do a bad job as a business owner. I want to do a bad job as a person. I want to show up as the worst version of myself today. I can see us all laying in bed, doing our morning mantras, going, yes,
I will
let
be a
me be that.
pain today. I will be a pain.
Yeah, let me be that crappiest version of self today, please. That's what I aspire to be, right? Nobody does that. But as a byproduct of not knowing ourselves well enough and not having the tools to move through these things, and I often call that the emotional hijacking, is that we end up being that
Mm.
version at times. We've all been there. I don't think any of us are ever immune. Even the highest performances in the world are, not immune to that. And so what I love seeing is, people say to me, even in my neurodiverse space, they're like, oh, do you do autism? Or do you? I'm like, I deal with the person.
Yeah.
The diagnoses are important, but it's the person as a whole person that we deal with. And so when we look at that, executive functioning is so important because every single person operates from a basis of having executive functioning skills. Some just operate have certain strengths and certain challenges. But if we level the playing field and understand that, then we all know that when we're calm and regulated, we tend to be operating in a better space than when we're stressed and dysregulated and overwhelmed and fatigued. So it's natural that we all understand that language. But then what?
Yeah.
How do we move through that? Like I know that I'm stressed. I know it's the end. It's Q4, man. It's November. We're leading up to Christmas. We're trying to wrap up. We're trying to plan for next year. We're trying to do all these things. Now what? I know that. Cool. I've got that bit down. But how do we move ourselves through that back to the calm state? Because that's where we make better decisions.
Yep.
That's where we make more informed decisions. That's where we're not letting our emotions hijack us. And that's what this work is so powerful in helping people navigate.
Yeah. So let's go into that work. I know
Mm.
you're dying to.
I'm just so passionate about it. I just love. I'm actually running a workshop tonight on it for families that are navigating little people that are having difficulties. But the funny thing is, when my parents come along, they love sitting there going, "Hmm, you're actually talking to me too, Kylie, aren't you?" And I'm
Yeah.
like,
It's
oh,
everyone. We all have
maybe,
it. If we didn't have
yeah,
executive functioning, we wouldn't be functioning.
absolutely. And I think it's just more evidence-based in neurodiversity. It's just more well researched.
Mm.
And so it's just more known. If you have a child with neurodiversity, one of the reports you will get will be around their executive functioning skills, whether it be from a psych, an OT, whoever. So we just don't talk about it in a more mainstream society, and we need to.
Mm.
So the executive functioning system is basically how our brain processes information. So if you think about an air traffic control tower guiding the planes into land, if you didn't have a system that worked effectively, everything would blow up and crash. And when our systems aren't working, it's essentially what happens in life, right? So, and depending on the research, there's lots of different ways they categorize it. At Elements for Success, I use 9 different domains. And the reason being is I think when I've got a reflective tool that I'm happy to send through to your audience that you can share out with people.
Great.
But when we are helping to, when we're trying to work through this, sometimes it's just a lot of information. I've got to understand how my brain works. And I think neuroscience is really good, but I think it gets really overwhelming when you start talking about the amygdala and you start talking about the frontal lobe and I'm like, do we really need that bit? Or do we need to just know that sometimes I actually have a really hard time being open-minded to another person's perspective and shifting my thinking? I get a little bit stuck and dug in to my thought process when I'm stressed. And I
Yep.
give a really good example of this all the time. So I worked in disability and complex behavior for 20 years, right? So I consider myself a reasonably flexible thinker. I'm really good. Like, you got a kid on a roof, you got a kid with a knife, you got a kid, all of these things that happen. You got to be pretty open-minded and pivot and shift your thinking pretty quickly to accommodate the circumstances. Otherwise, you might get hurt, injured, whatever. So I like to think of myself as pretty open-minded. I'm an out-of-the-box thinker. I think creatively, which is why I love the corporate work, because the lens I bring is a bit different from some of the traditional models that people have used. But when I'm calm and regulated, I'll go home, and if I've given my kids a list of jobs to do and they haven't done it, I'm like, hey guys, what happened here? We had a bit of a plan. What happened? Why didn't it go to plan? But if I'm stressed, overwhelmed, and they're not even anything to do with them, just in life, I've had 17 emails that I need to get to today, or didn't get that call back, or whatever it was. And I'm stressed, tired, fatigued, overwhelmed, feeling a bit dysregulated. I go home and my flexibility to be open minded to the fact that something went on in their world is gone. I'm like, we had a plan. No, no tech. And I've become really rigid in my thinking. And in the last couple of years, I've started to walk in and go, ah, okay. So when I haven't naturally picked up that I'm feeling stressed, because
Mm.
sometimes we're just in the busyness of the day, we don't have those normal cues. Like, it wasn't a stressful event particularly that happened. Sometimes that's the first sign that I'm like, no, I actually might be a bit stressed today because my flexibility is not there. I've become a bit more rigid in my thinking than I normally am. Now, that may not be your cue if you're already a pretty rigid thinker. If you like things a certain way and you get really dysregulated when they don't go the way that you plan, you might, even in calm, be a relatively rigid thinker. And that may not be the cue that you've dysregulated, but maybe it's one of the other executive functioning areas. So we'll go through some of those. So I talk about flexibility all the time because it's just such a very common thing. And we tend to purely associate it with the autism spectrum, that people can't change the plan. But in actual fact, I actually think it's one of the key things that happens to most people under stress. When you look at teamwork,
Yep.
people want it my way. I'm not listening to what you have to say because I've got a plan. It needs to go the way that I wanted it, right?
Yeah,
But
I've seen that, where someone who's been, oh, very flexible,
oh,
very relaxed manager,
we,
and then things go under pressure and they slam into micromanagement mode, and you're like, okay.
yeah. And instead of going, because we know that micromanagement's not we know that it doesn't work,
Yeah,
right? But we've got to get to the function of why it happens.
yeah,
And so them even understanding that when they get stressed, that's a natural propensity that comes from reduced flexibility in your thinking.
yeah.
That's how your executive functioning is hijacking you. All of a sudden, you're like, oh, okay, so I have to be mindful of that. It's a consciousness process. One of the other ones we talk about response inhibition, and that's not really that thinking and maybe before you act or before you speak, right? So I'm a pretty calm, regulated person again. I'm quite a considered person in the way that I speak, reply to emails, but I guarantee that most of your audience have at some point in time either said that offhanded comment or the email they're like, when they should have just paused before they sent that email, right? And so under stress, that can be something that happens more frequently when you're feeling overwhelmed, maybe potentially. And you see it all the time on social media, people's responses. And maybe they're genuinely, normally a pretty regulated person, but under stress, they've kind of said that comment, and you're like, wow, that was kind of like pretty harsh. Or they've gone and sent that email that they're trying to then find the unsend button on 5 minutes later, or you wake up the next morning and you're like, oh, damn, I probably shouldn't have done that, right? It's again, we often talk about emotional control in the sense that we know when we've lost our fascism, but there's lots of signs along the way that we're getting there. And I talk about understanding our escalation scale in that. So, when we've lost it, well, yes, we know that we're dysregulated. But the goal is to not get there in the first place, right? So having that self-monitoring, being aware enough along the way, and our body being able to read our body cues. And I think this is pretty difficult for women, mums in particular, because our natural inclination is to worry about everybody else.
Yeah.
And when I say to people, what do you need? The women I talk to often say, I'm not sure, or I don't know, because
Or
they
I
feel
just
kind
need
of,
sleep, and then everything will be magically better.
oh, 100%. And sleep is number one, but how do you get that? And
Yeah.
but for women and mums in particular, I think, and particularly mums in business, it's no one's taken the time, or not many people have had the opportunity to take the time to look inwards. There's a bit of guilt associated with that too, sometimes around if I'm taking time to recognize what I need, am I being selfish? In actual fact, I just so recommend people, it's so selfless because you're going to show up for other people better
Mm.
if you can take the time to do yourself. But when I talk to people about what support you need, I'm like, well, if you don't know what you need, how can other people know what you need also? And then people, I call it the support grenade. People are launching support grenades left, right, and center, going, oh, I'll help you by doing this. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, that's not hit the mark. And now they're offended because they've tried to support you and it didn't work. And now you're offended because they didn't understand you in the first place. But because you didn't know what you needed, oh, happens all of the time, right? How do we know that? And that's that self-monitoring piece.
Mm.
But even in, things like, so metacognition is thinking about thinking. So it's our ability to reflect in the moment and then be flexible to be able to pivot. Or after something happened, be able to reflect. And instead of getting stuck in that spiral of, I'm just a bad person, I'm terrible, I'm a terrible business person, I'm a terrible mom, which is unhelpful spiral. Reflecting is, okay, what worked well there? And what can I do more of? And what didn't work well without judgment? And what can I change, reduce, or eliminate moving forward, right?
Yeah.
And I just, that has been one of the most powerful tools. And everybody wants to go to the what's not working well part. Like our brains are wired for negativity bias. So everyone's over here. I have two columns and I don't let people go to that bit until they've done the good bit. And they're like, Kylie, I've got one thing on the what's working well. And I'm like, I haven't seen you for a month. And you're telling me in 30 days, you have one thing in your life that worked well. It's just harder because brains are so wired to go, well, I didn't get time to do this. I should have done this. I should have done this. I should have
Yeah.
done this, right? But if you sit, and we know that through our reticular activating system, our brain works to filter information. So if we can focus on what's working well, it snowballs and now filters our brain to start looking for other things that are going well
Yeah.
and good in our lives, right? So again, just such a powerful executive function. But when we're hijacked emotionally, our ability to reflect can be impacted. And we don't have that same skill set that we've got when we are on holidays, sitting on a beach, doing our journaling and doing our gratitude, right? If the environment is right, we can do it. But we have to learn how to bring ourselves back, regulate our executive functioning enough so that we can do it more effectively in higher stress times so that we can move back to those calm spaces without having to go to the beach. Although, I'm happy to do that at the beach with anyone that would like to. That's my happy place. More than happy to help out. So we also talk about things like task initiation. So I didn't recognize, I've been doing this work for 20 years, but until I started applying it to myself, I had a few, maybe some revelations that hurt my feelings a little bit.
Mhm.
And one of them was that I've recognized one of the very first signs of stress for me is my task initiation goes out the window. And what I mean by that is my ability to get started on tasks that are within my capability, right? So I remember when I first moved out of education and I was running my own business, I only knew one person that had their own business. My friend had her business, and I'd ring her up and I'd go, "Oh my God, I've got 20 things to do today and I can't get started on any of them." And they're not hard jobs, like it's send an email to this person or put up that social media post or do this or do that. And I'm like, so the 5 minute task, like not even. And I cannot get, and I realized that task initiation or lack of task initiation was probably one of my first stress indicators, as opposed to my brain going, "Oh, you're actually feeling really stressed." So just understanding that and recognizing that if I'm having trouble getting started, getting organized, and getting started on my task in the morning, I actually need to ground myself and go, "Hey, what's going on? You're okay. And this will take 2 minutes." And those self narrative to myself needed to change in order to me to get that stuff happening.
So to me, that sounds a lot like, and because I worked a lot with higher education students, is that procrastination over assessments. Like I can't get it
Yeah,
started, or I can't just send it off and submit it. It's just sitting there, but I can't quite do that.
yeah. So task initiation is the first part of it. And then the next part of it is the planning, prioritizing, organization, and time management. So we if we don't know how to get started, we can get stuck in perfectionism and procrastination as a byproduct of the fact that we don't know how to get started. And we don't know how to plan and prioritize and organize our time, our thoughts, our energy. And perfectionism is a bit of a byproduct of that. Oh, I can't hand it in because it's not right. But sometimes it's just that executive functioning part that we actually need that scaffolding of what needs to work for us, right? But yeah, really, really common. And we talk a lot about procrastination, and you just need to do it. Cool. But if your executive functioning is not working effectively, you can tell your brain that you've got to do it. That doesn't actually make it a reality. But if you understand that under stress, your planning and prioritizing is diminished, you can take some time to calm yourself down, find some strategies to work there because you know that you're more effective in your regulated state. But if you have trouble prioritizing and planning and organizing, and if anyone's on TikTok and watches any neurodiverse stuff and watches any ADHD stuff, it is a challenge for people in that space. So then you need to, so whether they're calm or whether they're dysregulated. So it means that your strategies and tools need to look maybe a little bit different than if it's only happening under stress.
Yeah.
Because if it's happening under stress, you need to move yourself back to calm where you operate efficiently. If you have trouble in calm and in stress, then you actually need some tools that are going to be functional for you. And what people don't tell you when you're looking, and again, if you sit on TikTok, you can get onto every latest fad going around, and you could spend millions and gazillions of dollars buying this scheduling tool or this tool or this tool or this tool. But it's a bit like trying on a shirt. You've just got to find one that fits for you and feels comfortable and doesn't have the itchy, scratchy label, because you won't be able to wear it for a longer period of time. So I talk about myself as like the Mary Poppins of strategies. I'm pulling them out of my bag like Mary Poppins pulled stuff out, and I've never run out like her bag. So, and I don't, when I'm working with people, sometimes it's not even the strategy, it's when you implement it. Sometimes it's the timing of the strategy. Because by the time you're stressed, it's not a bad strategy, it just doesn't work in that state. It
Yep.
only works over here. So instead of saying nothing works, we break it down into more manageable chunks. And we look at what strategies do work in what context and what time. So, and help people navigate that and facilitate that. We talk about sustained attention. So being able to stay focused on task. We all know that flow is the magic word and getting into flow. But, for me, some days are better than others.
Yep.
And sometimes, people sit there and go, don't do anything and just focus on getting in your flow in the morning. Well, dude, if I haven't sent that email, there is no way I'm going to get in flow, because my anxiety will be through the roof, and I need to do that bit
And that's
first.
all you can think about, because your thoughts are circling around it.
So consuming.
Yeah.
So I understand the premise, but again, for some people that will work. I can get up in the morning, I can do this, right? Other people might need to get some of the superfluous crap out of the way in order to have that time block later in the day, right? And there's no right or wrong way. There's just what's right for you. And if you understand how your brain works in terms of this executive functioning stuff, you can make it work for you much more effectively. So, the world is not deprived of knowledge. You only have to go on TikTok, you only have to go on YouTube, you only have to, like, there's 1,000 million strategies in terms of what's available. But how do you know what will work for you? Instead of feeling like a failure because you've tried that one and you've tried that one and you've tried that one and it didn't work, is if you understand this bit, the foundational piece of understanding how your brain works, then you'll be able to find the right strategies for the right circumstance for you that will help you move through that much more effectively, instead of feeling bad because, I don't know, you didn't jump on the Kerwin Rays, or you didn't jump on the Tony Robbins, or you didn't, all of these different amazing people. And don't get me wrong, all this stuff is good, but it works for some people in some contexts. It's not a one size fits all rule, right? And that depends. And it might even work for you when you're calm, and it doesn't work for you when you're stressed. And that's the bit that how understanding the executive functioning works more effectively. Goal persists. Oh, sorry, you're going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say it's like not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because often you'll get a little gem from each one, or you'll at least kind of be able to use it to refine and say, okay, well, I know that when I did it this way it worked, and this way it didn't work so well, but this bit was okay and this bit was really good. So I kind of siphon it down.
100%. And it's about, and when you're feeling so overwhelmed, there's a term called cognitive load, right? So cognitive is your brain, and load. And so we know that when we are under high states of stress, fatigue, burnout, overwhelm, and burnout is just a really extended version of overwhelm and stress and fatigue, right? We know that the cognitive load feels heavier, and we tend to associate it with lack of skill or lack of ability or something wrong with us. It's just that sometimes things are heavy. And I put up a post on LinkedIn this morning, actually. So yesterday was a really good example of that. My morning started with my sewage pipe breaking in my house. So yesterday, oh yeah, it was very classy. I won't put a bit, like, seriously, cannot describe how disgusting it was. And I actually happened to be with a client in a session, and my son is ringing me going, "Hey, Mum, there's this really gross thing that's happening in the house." And I'm like, "Oh, send me some photos." And I'm like, whoa. Now, I'm a really good I can do things in my sleep a lot of the time. I'm really good at advocacy. I do all the time. But I have to tell you, my cognitive load from that incident yesterday was heavy. I was so tired when I got home last night from doing the same tasks that I do most days, because of the additional load that was put on me by having to navigate a really a shitty circumstance. Ha ha, pardon the pun. But it was just something else I didn't need in my day, right? And so what happens is, as a result of that, not that my skills are any different from the day before, because I've now got this cognitive load that I've had to deal with, it was just harder for me to get through. Doesn't mean I didn't do it, just was harder. I was more tired, I was more fatigued. And now I can recognize that when I came home, I actually said to my kids, hey, today was pretty tough for me because, plumber didn't do the right thing, I had to call him back, blah, 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 blah. It was all just stuff I didn't need in my day. So tonight, we just need to chill out. So can we just keep it pretty low key today? But that's because I've done the work on this executive functioning to know that I shouldn't push myself through that now.
Yeah.
Otherwise, that will not work well for anybody, especially me. But it won't work as a byproduct, won't work for anyone else. I won't be able to show up for my clients. I won't be able to show up for my kids. I won't be able to show up in my business. Wouldn't be able to show up on this podcast, right? As effectively had I kept pushing through and doing the things. So that's understanding. And goal persistence is about how resilient we are to sticking with something, right? And, one of my favorite references I use in coaching all the time is the wise words of Kenny Rogers. You got to know when to hold them. You got to know when to fold them. He's a wise coach that's been around for a very long time. But it's true. But have you ever noticed that you still want something, but your ability to keep focused on it is difficult sometimes, and other times it's not? Again, our executive functioning is hijacking us to stick with something that normally we would be able to do. So again, we've got to bring ourselves back to, okay, what do we do now? One of the things that people talk to me a lot about is their memory. People are feeling like they're forgetting things, particularly towards the end of the year. There's lots and lots of things you play, and we call that our working memory, being able to do the thing that we know how to do in the context that we're doing it and be able to recall that, and use it in that moment. And sometimes that could be as simple as finding the words. If you're going through a phase where you're like, I know I just can't find that word that I'm looking for, and that's happening repeatedly, that could be your executive functioning not working effectively, or forgetting to do the tasks that normally, again, in your day-to-day routine, and then for all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, forgot that I needed to do that, or I forgot how to do that, or being able to show up. And so again, we get very angry at ourselves when we're having trouble with that particular, I should remember this, or I should know this. I do know this, all these things. And we tend to focus inwards and punish ourselves instead of actually going, I wonder what's going on for me, that I'm being a little bit more, I'm having a bit of a harder time recalling this than normal. Maybe I haven't picked up the cue that I'm heading towards that stress, fatigue space, overwhelmed. Maybe that's my cue that I'm heading there, rather than the blow up, the yelling, the screaming, the crying, instead of getting to that point and going, oh, I am stressed. There are lots of cues along the way. And if we can navigate that earlier, then we stop those blow-ups, whether they be the withdrawal, shut down, don't answer my emails for a week because I can't deal with people, or I'm biting everyone's head off. The goal is to not get to that point. So if we can navigate that earlier through our executive functioning, understanding what happens for us, and there will be signs. If we take the time to reflect, we will all operate differently. I know that task initiation is one of the first things that goes for me. I know that emotional control is one of the last things that goes for me. But if I get there, it's a bad day. It's a really bad day.
Yep.
Right.
And it's just about to get worse.
Yeah. And then I've got guilt and shame and all of that, right? So we go into that shame shitstorm that Brené Brown talks about. And I want to be there. Nobody wants me to be there. I certainly don't want to be there. But if I can recognize it early enough, so task initiation is one of the first things that happens to me, working memory, flexibility. My ability, I become more rigid in my thinking, and I get a little bit resentful when I have to change my plans. That's a really big sign that I'm moving up that scale. And if I can address it early and go, oh, that was a bit rigid, then I can address it there and I don't end up there.
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So they're the kind of 9 areas that I talk about. And I've got this graphic that I'll send through for everyone that they can
Awesome.
kind of reflect on. And you might just sit there and go, one of the activities I do with my clients is we get the different skills, the different, sorry, domains, and go a bit of a self rating. Okay, so if 10 is I'm actually really good at this, and 0 is I'm terrible at this, what rating am I going to give myself when I'm calm, relaxed, in flow, regulated, feeling in my vibe, got the vibes happening, as the kids say. And then what does that look like in my stress state? What am I giving myself out of 10? And do you know what's really interesting is some people notice that they become hyper focused under stress. So their organization turns into a bit of micromanagement and they're actually more organized under stress. But that can not be a great thing, also, sometimes,
Yeah.
right? So if you're under stress, you're giving yourself a 10 for organization. That's a precursor to micromanagement and controlling behaviors because you're so stressed.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily a great thing, right? So we can have a bit of a self-assessment. And if you actually have trouble, so when we are not as self-aware and we're not getting the outcomes we want in life, whether it be personal or professional, sometimes we need a safe person to talk to and say, hey, what do you notice in me in these domains? How do you know that I maybe are struggling a little bit? Because I'm actually having trouble reading the cues.
Yeah.
I'm not picking them up clearly because, I've cried for the last 5 days out of 7. So I've ended up in that negative set that I want to be in. So what am I missing here along the way in that journey? But you have to do that with safe people, right? Yeah.
It just reminded me of,
Mhm.
because I mean, we were very fortunate during COVID. We didn't have much in the way of lockdown. But the first shutdown where we had to have the kids at school, after a week, I
Ah,
called school and
yeah.
said, look, I'm spending every day either crying or screaming. Can you please take my children? Because I'm not managing this with everything else I'm trying to
Yeah.
do.
100%. And it was, it's hilariously, I was a teacher, right? And I'm like, dude, I'm pulling essential worker card. You guys are going to go back to school. I can't
Mm,
cope. And my kids won't cope with, because my job in that house, my hat is the mum.
yeah.
And it's not the teacher. And so we sit there and go, I should be able to. The shoulda, woulda, coulda, right? And I'm like, but why?
Yeah.
And if we understand that you were probably feeling really overwhelmed in that stage, and so your ability to organize, and you might be really efficient, like in business, you might be nailing it, like you might be all over that stuff. And then when you put into a more complex, you know, I heard there's a line in a report that I read once. It says, when the environment exceeds your capacity. And I'm like, man, I am taking that line because it is so true that we have skills to hear,
Yeah.
right? But when things in our environment, whether it's, I'm working with a gentleman at the moment, he's a very high level government entity, and they're going through a massive change through their whole organization. And he's not coping, not because he's not skilled. The level of change in his environment exceeds his toolbox of capacity to be able to manage that change,
Yeah.
right? So and COVID was a really good example of that. Our environment exceeded most people's capacity.
Yeah.
What was happening to us in our environment, whether that be a person changing, the lockdown, all of those things exceeded many people's capacity for their current level of skills.
Yeah.
And so
Because
we
it
just have
wasn't
to
progressive. We learn
no.
progressively, not one big wham.
Yeah, it was like a hijacking, chopped your legs out from under you and
Yeah.
went, hey guys, we're here and we don't know how to navigate this. And I think when we're navigating uncertainty, that's another really often a really common thing that emotionally hijacks people is that I don't actually. So I'm a single mum of 3 kids that runs 2 businesses, right? I have a high need for certainty in my life because I'm like a traffic controller in itself, right? Trying to organize this kid's going to sport, this kid's going to work, this kid's going to school. this business is doing that business is doing that, right? So I live and die by my diary. If it is not in my diary, the chances of my ability to be able to engage in that activity with you is much greater reduced than if and some people they don't like being locked into a diary. They like the flexibility and the flow. They have a much more, a greater ability to navigate uncertainty. And that doesn't mean that I can't do uncertainty, but I'm a much higher operator. I tend to stay in my calm state much longer if I have some predictability and certainty in my day. I turn up to my office at the same time every day because I like the routine. It gives me flexibility to have the discipline of being able to do that.
Yeah.
Other people would go, oh my God, that's the worst thing I've ever heard, because it doesn't work for their brain.
Yeah.
So you've just got to figure out what works for you, right?
And that's the big thing. There's nothing wrong with that, you being different, because we're just ourselves. And so we need to be able to let go of that belief that we're not good enough, or we should be doing it differently or better or whatever, because there is no better. It is what works for us as an individual.
And do you know what? In my language, when I'm talking to people now, I will often say, I actually operate better if we lock in a date now,
Yeah.
if that works for you.
Yeah.
And that's my way of actually self-advocating that I need that certainty. And that's not a bad thing. And when I put it in that way and say, look, it works much better for my brain if I have a bit of a plan about where you want to go, people are like, oh, okay, cool.
And it gives them permission. It normalizes that
Yeah,
appreciation
100%.
that it's okay to be different.
And we often think that people think like us. So
Mm.
if you don't need a plan, it doesn't necessarily always occur to you that other people might need a plan.
Yeah.
And that you kind of sit there and go, oh, they're just being so, stuck or whatever. But in order for my brain to operate most effectively and at my highest level, I tend to have, need a version of the plan. The plan can change. I'm not that rigid, but I like the certainty of knowing. I like I'm running a workshop next Monday, right? I've had that booked in for 2 months. Now, my friend is like, oh, yeah, I'm not really sure what I'm doing next month. That works for her. It doesn't work for me because I've got so many moving parts in my
Yep.
world. If I don't want to miss out giving someone an opportunity because they weren't able to forward plan enough to lock that in with me now. So I communicate that. And I say it really works better for me if I know in advance what you'd like, and then I can accommodate that. I'm really good with that. And if I get there and it's different, that's fine. I can do it. But if I've got a place to go, time to go,
Yeah.
that's fabulous, right? And so I think that's, again, permission to advocate, because if I don't know what I need, people inadvertently will upset me and not know why. And then I'm feeling all cranky with them because I actually haven't articulated what I need. And that's my responsibility in that.
Yes.
I talk a lot, I give presentations on psychological safety. And I talk a lot about in organizations, we've kind of created this idea that the organization should provide for me, which is true. The organization should provide, but what's your individual responsibility in that space?
Yeah.
And we forget that, mind reading, to my knowledge, is not a degree that you can do. It's not a subject taught in anything still.
It would be helpful, but yes.
Wouldn't it just? So what I'm going to do is, because I'm a kind and caring person, I'm going to help you the way that I like to be helped, or I'm going to help you how I think would be helpful. That doesn't necessarily mean any of what I do is actually helpful.
Yeah.
The most helpful thing that you could do is tell me what help you need, and then I can actually help you by providing the help that you actually need instead of guessing.
Yeah. And so
that takes some time.
Talking about help, what do you do to keep yourself grounded and cared for?
I love the beach. I love the water.
I hadn't picked that up.
I don't know if I've said that many times. So I actually have just booked in to go catch up with a friend at the beach on Sunday. And I've booked my holiday over Christmas at the beach this week. So I've got something to work towards. I'm a reader. Not sure if you could tell. And I actually love reading. Like people are like, oh my gosh, but I actually really enjoy it. Grounds me because it gives me a sense of security in building my knowledge that I'm offering that stuff. So I actually read for relaxation. And I have to be it's really interesting, particularly in the last couple of years. I noticed when I was pregnant with my kids, I had to be really mindful about what I consumed
Yep.
because the hormones and the nightmares and the woo, all the murder mystery stuff. Oh, good God, I couldn't watch any of it, right, when I was pregnant. But even as I've gotten older, I have to be mindful about what I consume, whether that be on social media, whether that be in books, whether that be on TV or any of that sort of stuff. Also mindful about who I spend time with because our energy is when you are empathetic as a person, you tend to absorb other people's energies. And I can absorb the energy from a character on a TV. I can do it from a character from a book. So I have to be really mindful. So having some mindfulness practices, gratitude practices. I've got a home gym that I'm working on, spending some quality time with my boys that are all both very energetic, connecting through exercise, doing all of those kind of things. That's how I ground myself. And having some good practices and working with mentors and coaches that help me craft the craziness that's in my head so that I've got a plan and strategy moving forward and having the right people in my corner, I think,
Yep.
and catching up. I think that's really important.
And if you were to go back to young Kylie, what would you tell yourself? What would you share?
I would most definitely really try and emphasize to back yourself and to take more chances. I can distinctly remember I was scared of my own shadow growing up. And I can distinctly remember in university having an opportunity to go overseas and not taking it because I was too scared of what would happen.
Mm.
And in most instances, what actually happens is far less than we think might happen. And whilst, taking a leap to run my own business is scary, my only regret is I should have done it 5 years earlier because honestly, it has been the most joyful thing I've done in the last 20 years. And I loved educating. I love kids. Like, don't get me wrong, I loved that space, but I have much more impact. And going back to my why of empowerment, I empower in so many different ways now in a way that aligns with my true north. So I'm walking in my purpose, walking my why every single day. And so having the courage to step out of my comfort zone. And I actually think the comfort zone, I feel like we should petition for it to be renamed because I think we should call it the familiar zone, not the comfort zone.
It's not always comfortable,
No, people don't stay there necessarily because they like it. People stay there because they know it.
and they're afraid of moving into something.
Moving forward, right?
Mm.
I left a domestically violent relationship, and people said to me for many years, why don't you just leave earlier? And it was, in some instances, better the devil you know. I
Mm.
knew what to expect rather than what my life was going to be like if I left with 3 kids.
Yeah.
That was scary to me. And I certainly wasn't happy. I wasn't okay. Nothing was good, but it was known.
Yeah.
And it was only when I had the courage to step out of that zone that things changed. And the only way I was able to do that was doing the work on myself
Yeah.
and overcoming some of those fears and being scared of my own shadow, moving through that kind of stuff.
And so what
And that,
triggered that? What triggered that move to start to understand yourself more and then be able to move out of that?
well, so when we sit in the whole, it's somebody else's fault,
Yeah.
nothing changes because you have no control over the other person, right? And now, whilst I don't, this is not as a victim of that experience, it wasn't my fault what was happening to me. His behavior was his behavior. But my lack of self-awareness about how I continued to end up in circumstances where people thought it was okay to treat me like that
Mm-hmm.
was my behavior to own. So whilst I totally do not take any responsibility for his actions and behavior, because that's his to own, what I could take responsibility is, what were the patterns that led me down to ending up in these vulnerable situations, where people felt that it was okay to treat me like that.
Yeah.
And whilst, you know, that's a pretty extreme example, domestic violence, I've had experiences in work environments, I've had experience in my life in general where people got to a point where they thought it was okay to treat me differently to how I thought I should be treated.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I did the work on myself to then put the boundaries in place, because you, like, again, going back to the people should think like me, why would you treat anyone like that? Because I certainly wouldn't treat anyone like that. And I think that treat others how you would like to be treated yourself is actually a bit of a misnomer, because I
Yeah.
feel like we all see the world through a different lens.
Yeah.
And so what respect looks like for me may not look like respect for somebody else.
Yeah.
I see the world through a different lens, and that's actually okay. And with that, going back to Brené Brown's work again, one of the best things was that braving framework. She talks about boundaries, and we think boundaries are really, really hard for people pleasers. Reformed people pleaser. I actually say reforming because I don't think I'm actually reformed, but reforming people pleasers is when I got to Brené Brown gave me the best definition. She said, a boundary is, this is what's okay for me and this is what's not okay. Instead of, you need to draw the line in the sand and you
Yeah.
need to do this, which seems so confrontational for me. If I just went back to, hey, it's okay for me that you're upset, it's not okay for you to call me names.
Yeah.
That's a really great way. In business, it's okay that you may not want this service. It's not okay for you to, blah, 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 whatever that is. So if I just went back to understanding that about myself and micro steps, it's all micro, in order to get to the macro, the big picture vision about where you want to go, it's all micro behaviors. And that executive functioning piece that I just am so passionate about, because it has moved the needle so significantly for me in terms of understanding that I have control over my life. We talk about all this, focus on what's in your control, not in your control.
Yeah.
Don't let go of that stuff. But it's really hard because that stuff is easier for us to identify.
Yeah.
So when we go back to the
Further
micros,
away.
yeah,
It's not caught up in us. And I can really see, like, I mean, I'm similar. I haven't had a violent relationship, but I've certainly had a lot of bullying in most
yeah,
places I've worked in some form or other. And so thinking about, okay, how, why have I got this pattern? Because, it tends to be, not everyone is, but once you are, you kind of are in a lot of situations. But when you're caught up in the middle of it, it's really hard to sort of sit back and notice that, because I don't realize that's what's happening until afterwards, and I kind of go, oh, I was really being bullied there for a long time.
yeah. And that's that metacognition piece, right? So being able
Mm.
to reflect in the moment versus after the moment.
Yeah.
And one of the other things that I present on is understanding the fact that we see the world through a different lens, right? So we've all got stories growing up about what it took to feel loved, valued, seen, heard, and accepted. So my story is that the way that I felt loved, valued, seen, heard, and accepted was being helpful.
Mm.
And so how can that be a bad thing, being helpful, right? And I talk about how adaptive behaviors, so good behaviors, we talk about adaptive behaviors. So behaviors that are good and healthy can become maladaptive, so they can be unhealthy,
Yeah.
right? So when I'm helping people altruistically, I just want to help, and, like your audience, I'm not on here for any other reason than I want to value add into their lives. And hopefully something I've said today resonated, hit a point that you're like, oh, wow, that was, yeah, really insightful. And that's going to help me on my journey. That's altruistic helping, right?
Yeah.
But when I'm helping because I'm trying to validate my worthiness as a person,
Mm.
I'm doing this for you, whether you want it or not. I'm going to help you,
Yeah.
right? Then that's maladaptive. So I've taken a healthy tool, a healthy strategy of being helpful, and used it in an unhealthy way. And I see this so much, again, with mums. Like, I've got a client at the moment who's going through a whole heap of stuff. And what's stopping her from doing the work on herself is she's taken an adaptive behavior, which is her children have complex needs. So therefore she is working really hard on getting their needs met, but it's actually stopping her from doing her work.
Yeah.
And so it's really tricky, isn't it? Because we've got a story about what it means to be a good parent. We've got a story about what it means to be a successful business owner. We've got a story about what it means to be a successful, a loving partner. All of these stories. And so sometimes it's almost like we don't notice. We've gone down this slide and we're in this unhealthy pattern of behavior before we even notice. But how do we move back to that?
Yeah.
Move to that healthier version of self?
And like I see it, um, it's that kind of good child syndrome in a way. Like I know for me, it was about keeping the peace. It was about managing other people's emotions, and I see it when I talk to my girls and I say, oh, thanks. That's really, you're such a good girl. And I'm like, oh, don't say that. Think about it's about
Yeah.
focusing on, that's really helpful, not you are a
Good. Yeah.
XYZ. Yeah.
Yeah. And being the peacemaker and the peacekeeper is one of the lenses in which we see the world. So how you kept yourself safe and valued, loved, seen and heard and accepted was your job potentially somewhere along the line was to do that, right? And so you tend to, and that's how sometimes sometimes you want to say no, but you say yes anyway, because you just don't want to upset people.
Yeah.
Sometimes the lens is there's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things. And how I kept myself under the radar was doing things the right way. So it kept me off other people's hit list because, and I often see that in clients that I coach that maybe have had an alcoholic parent. Not exclusively that, but it's a very common pattern that the alcoholic parent that maybe used to have some blow ups, if you were doing things right and you had, your chores done, your room cleaned, all that kind of stuff, it kept you under the radar. My son has to be the best at everything. So the reason that I'm ready to ship him off to boarding school right now is we're in assessments, and he puts so much pressure on himself because somewhere along the line, and it's quite ironic to me because I've actually never looked at grades, but somewhere along the lines, he's interpreted that he gets valued by being the best at things.
Yeah.
And so again, that's not an unhealthy attribute to have, to strive to be good at things. But when you validate your self-worth, that, this is a kid that lost his for shizzle because he got 90% on a maths test. And I'm like, what?
Yeah.
But understanding now that lens in which he sees the world, because I'd be like cheering. And so we have the propensity to invalidate his feelings by not going, oh, don't worry about it. It's 90%, right? But for him, who needs to be the best at something, it's like, oh man, are you okay? That's really tough. What do you need? And helping him find acceptance in that space is going to support him on his journey.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, I have a different former partner, and his thing was around, he grew up in a really tough environment. He was the oldest boy, and his job was to be strong for his family. So when we were dating, and I would offer support, he would get really agitated at me at sometimes. And I'm sitting there going, I'm trying to be a loving, supporting, caring partner. How is that going badly? But the story is that if I was offering help, he interpreted that I thought he was weak. And I'm like, didn't even occur to me. Like, no, I just wanted to show support. So what I had to do was change the way that I offered support, because that was the lens in which he saw the world. And it wasn't a right or wrong lens. It was an accumulation of his experiences. And so I wanted to be that person that was available to him, but I also had to validate the fact that it was really important for him to be seen as having strength.
Yeah.
It was okay to be vulnerable, but the way that I offered support was one through supporting him to be strong, as opposed to maybe, again, flippantly offering some support that maybe lent itself to him interpreting that I didn't think he was able to do the job.
Yeah.
And so that's how I've changed and pivoted. And that's what's so important when we're navigating all of this space, is we've got to understand ourselves, our own triggers. Because I remember a couple of arguments. I'm like, how the hell did that go wrong? Being a supportive, loving, caring person. good God, like, what happened there? But
Yeah.
understanding that if I couldn't be helpful, if I wasn't being perceived as helpful, that was actually a trigger for me,
Yeah.
as much as it was for him, feeling like an over. So we've got to understand that. And now being able to check myself and going, am I offering to do this because I just genuinely want to value add into someone's life, or am I trying to validate my worth in some way? Is there something going on in the background? I'm feeling a need, a driver to do that. So understanding how that works as well.
Yeah. Wow. That huge amount of food for thought for today, Kylie. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
Just that I'm so grateful for being on there. I understand that regional or remote is really tough. It has its different complexities to potentially being in a city. But I think if we can understand how our brain works and how we work, it allows us to show up in the version of ourselves that who we really want to be and to get the outcomes that we really want. So even through complex circumstances, we can still achieve and succeed in whatever it is that we're aiming to do. And I'd love to support anyone on their journey if they need some additional help in that space.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah.
So grateful.
Today we've been yarning with Kylee Leota. She's founder and chief vision officer for Elements for Success. She's a leadership and HPT coach, director of Advocates for Wellness, behavior change specialist, Amazon author, investor, multi-business owner. We know she's busy, and she's got 3 very interesting children, providing all sorts of opportunities for growth and personal development. And she's passionate about empowering people of all ages to develop the confidence, skills, and tools they require to live a life of their design and purpose that works for them. And of course, you can connect with Kylee through our Queen Bee platform, and we'll also provide her LinkedIn profile for you to check out. Thank you again.
Thanks, Sonia.
The Queen Bee podcast delves into the heart of regional women's experiences, their aspirations, challenges, and journeys. It's a platform that celebrates their individuality, their resilience, and their ambition. These tales of reinvention, adaptation, inspiration, and the power of connections.